In this video, I want to begin a series on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through Matthew 7. That's my intention at the moment. Anyway, I want to look at what we have recorded that Yeshua said, because we have it recorded in Greek, and it's just like us only having what he said recorded in English. The English would be an approximation of what he said in the original language, as we've seen throughout the series of Wednesday videos. The actual Hebrew of what was said is more valuable. Once it's translated into Greek, it loses some of its original meaning. Greek to English, it's gone 2 steps down the chain. It loses a little bit more. But if you imagine that you were there and you heard what he said and you wrote down an English translation of what he said, it wouldn't really capture the full essence of what he said. And you might be thinking, well, we only have the Greek manuscript. But that's not actually true. We'll see another manuscript as we go through, known as Shem Matthew. We have 28 copies of it, or 28 manuscripts of Shem Matthew, which is written in Hebrew, and I think that there is good reason to believe that it is at least a copy of what was originally recorded. By the time we go to Greek, maybe there were 2 meanings of a Hebrew word, which could be the possible meaning, and the scribe has picked one word over another, making the meaning of what he said much more definite. But you'll see what I'm talking about as we go through. So there are actually 2 instances that people might think of as being the Sermon on the Mount. But if we go to the beginning of Matthew 5, it says, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. So he's seated on a mountain. They went up because of crowds. Having opened his mouth, he was teaching them, saying, and now we get the Sermon on the Mount. But the other instance that people might think of as being the Sermon on the Mount is actually Luke 6. But here it says, coming down with them, he stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great number of people. So what is recorded here is actually another incident. This is known among kind of New Testament scholars as the Sermon on the Plain, and it is similar to the Sermon on the Mount. It's got some of the style of delivery is similar, but it's important for us to note that these are actually 2 different incidents that are recorded here. One where he sees the crowds and goes up onto a mountain, the other when he comes down and he's standing on a plain. And there are many kind of theories about the Sermon on the Mount. Some people say that it's like the New Testament version of the 10 words. So we've got 10 blessed are statements instead. I don't really think that that's credible. What I think is, if you want to kind of see a parallel in the Old Testament. I think it's in Leviticus 27, when just before all of the blessings and curses are given, Deuteronomy 27, just before the blessings and the curses in Deuteronomy 28, we see a list of statements which are, cursed are those who do this thing, and all the people say, Amen. We don't have a corresponding set of blessings that are recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. So I kind of think of this as being the New Testament correlate. We see that they are to go up on one mount to pronounce the curses, on another, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, to pronounce the blessings. So I kind of think of this as him going up on a mount and doing the blessings. That's just the way that I think of it, though. That's not how Scripture teaches it to be. I just think that there's interesting correlations there. I think that quite possibly this was Mount Ebal. We're not told what mount it was that he went up on, but quite possibly it's Mount Ebal. But that's speculation. It's certainly not what the Bible teaches. Just a thought that comes to my mind. Now, when Yeshua was teaching on the mountain, the way that the Jews split up the scriptures was into the Tanakh, and Tanakh is an acronym from Torah, the Naviim, and the Ketuvim, which is roughly speaking the law or the teaching and the instruction, the prophets and the writings. What Yeshua is doing here is he's teaching from what they also knew as the wisdom, as the writings. He was teaching counsel from the scriptures. And we see this division referred to either intentionally or unintentionally in Ezekiel 7:26. Calamity upon calamity shall come, and report shall be upon report, and they shall seek a vision from a prophet, but the teaching has perished from the priest, and counsel from the elders. So we see the people who will be teaching these things. Prophecy from the prophet, Torah from the priest, and counsel from the elders or the leaders. And what Yeshua is teaching here would fall into this category. In the divisions of the Tanakh, it would be in the Ketuvim, part of the Tanakh, in the writings. And you'll see a lot of scriptures from particularly the Psalms, which is where Yeshua is drawing a lot of what he is teaching in this sermon. He draws from the Psalms and other scriptures too, but this is the style of teaching that Yeshua was doing. I think of the New Covenant writings, or the New Testament, as it's known as, like the wisdom section. It's certainly not the Torah. Yeshua didn't come and teach a new Torah. You could argue that sections of it are the prophets, like the book of Revelation, but largely it's kind of the writings, the wisdom. If you think of the Torah telling you what is good and what is bad, the prophets kind of like a warning to his people to follow the Torah, and then the writings are largely kind of commentary on how to do the Torah, how to implement the word and the wisdom of doing so. So if I was to pick a category for the New Covenant writings, I would put them in the writings. It's important for us to bear this in mind. In Acts 26:14, Paul says that he heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language. Now this is Yeshua that is speaking to Paul at this point, and it's of note that Paul says he spoke to me in the Hebrew language. Greek was certainly a language that a lot of people at the time spoke. You know, a lot of people were bilingual. But Paul specifies here that Yeshua came to him and he spoke in Hebrew. There's an argument to be made that Aramaic would have been a popular language at the time. But here we're specifically told Yeshua speaks in Hebrew. Paul understands what he says when it is spoken in Hebrew. Now, when I think of Yeshua, a Jew in the first century, coming and speaking to Jews, I don't think he was speaking in Greek. We have what he said recorded in Greek, but I think he was probably speaking in Hebrew, or at the very least Aramaic, to the people. So we have it recorded in Greek, but they wouldn't have been the words that he spoke, in my opinion. So, as I mentioned before, we can look to Shem Tov. This is Shem Tov. You can see there that it's got the Hebrew as well as then an English translation. What we should remember when we're looking at the English translation, again, it is not what is said in the Hebrew. In order for us to understand what is said in Hebrew, we need to understand the Hebrew. The English translation here is just a translation of the Hebrew. So as we go through, we will be looking at the Hebrew of what is said. In the English translation of the Greek, we read, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are. And that comes from this Hebrew phrase. This is Ashrei. Ashrei from this word, which is Esher, and it means happiness or blessedness, translated sometimes as blessed are. That's the Hebrew. It's not the word that we have recorded, obviously, in the New Testament. That's the Greek word, but it's from Esher that we get the name Asher, and Asher means happy or blessed. It could mean. Asher is actually the name of one of the tribes, obviously being the name of one of Jacob's sons, one of the sons of Israel, his actual direct descendants. That's where we get this noun, Asher, as it says here. Proper locative noun, which means it's the name of a place, or proper masculine noun, being the name of his son and the name of a tribe. I'm sure that you could get a feminine version of this noun also. But that's where we get Asher from. So when he is speaking, what he is most likely to have said, in my opinion, is Ashrei, rather than whatever the Greek translation that we have is. As I say, he was very unlikely to be speaking Greek words to them, because only a portion of them would have understood what he was saying, and why would he be speaking in Greek anyway? I can't tell you that the Hebrew in Shem Tov's Matthew is actually the direct Hebrew that he said, but you'll see as we go through, understanding the Hebrew actually allows us to understand a lot more of what is said than the Greek, which kind of takes what Yeshua would have said in Hebrew and makes it kind of a concrete translation in Greek. So if you've got a word that could mean three things in Hebrew, one of those things is chosen in Greek as, well, this is what he meant. And that's not actually necessarily the case. In Matthew 3, we see, blessed are the tochos in spirit, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So if we want a better insight into what was actually said, we can go to Shem Tov. It might be the original manuscript from which the Greek was translated, or it could just be a recording in Hebrew. It's actually unlikely to be that it was translated from the Greek. You can see how the Greek would have come from the Hebrew, but it's not so readily apparent how the Hebrew would have come from the Greek. In many cases, there is actually a version of the Gospels that you can get, a Hebrew version of the Gospels, translated by a guy called Delitzsch. And what he did was he translated the Greek into not just the Hebrew of his time, but into biblical Hebrew, because he was trying to convert Jews. So he gave them the New Testament in a form that would have been more accessible to them, as if it was written in biblical Hebrew. So they would have thought that it was like reading the Tanakh. And the translations that Delitzsch chooses, going from Greek to Hebrew, are often not the same as we find in Shem Tov's Matthew. Shem Tov seems to be the original, although I can't tell you that that's definitely true. And I'm sure many people will like the idea that the Greek was inspired. And I'm not here to argue about that with people, just to give you a perspective of what the Sermon of the Mount is on the Mount, rather, is like in Hebrew. So if we go to Shem Tov, we see this phrase translated poor in spirit in the Greek. But if you look at the shape of the letters there, if you don't read Hebrew, because we're going to see this phrase actually used in the Tanakh in that form. You might recognize the last word there as Ruach. I think it's Shafal Ruach. Here is a related word. This is a feminine noun which refers to a part of Israel known as the lowland or the valley. And this word is Shephelah. From this verb, shafel, which means to be or become low, be humbled or be abased. So when it says, blessed are the shafal ruach, it is not so much poor in spirit as perhaps humble in spirit, but probably more precisely the low in spirit, those whose spirits are low. And we'll see how that phrase is used in the Tanakh. We see here to depress, cast down, make low, and we actually see he uses this phrase that we see there. That's the phrase that we had in Hebrew Matthew, and Gesenius says that it is to be cast down of spirit, to be low of spirit. There it is. Proverbs 16:19 uses this exact phrase. It says, better to be lowly in spirit with the poor, with the ani, than to divide the spoil with the proud. So you can see, going from the Hebrew that we have in Shem Matthew to the Greek, you can see how you would end up with poor in spirit. But it's kind of making a very concrete translation of a phrase which has much more meaning in the Hebrew. And perhaps someone translating into Greek isn't going to be aware of when that Hebrew phrase is used in the scriptures. But obviously Yeshua was the Word made flesh. Yeshua knew exactly what he was saying. And we can see, if we look at the Hebrew of this verse, okay, we've got ani, and it says poor, afflicted, humble, or wretched, not necessarily just poor. So it's better to be low in spirit with the ani, with those who are low, with those who are humble. So again here, this is a good example. We've got the English from the Hebrew, and we've got with the poor, which makes ani a very definite thing, makes them the poor, those who don't have many means, those who are kind of not wealthy, whereas ani has a much broader meaning. So the poor are low in spirit. They are shafal ruach, so to speak. This is Proverbs 16:19. We can see that phrase there, the one that's used in Shem Tov's Matthew, shafal ruach. In Isaiah 57 verse 15, we see something similar. It says, I dwell in the holy or set apart place with him who has a bruised and shafal ruach, that phrase, to revive the spirit of the humble, which is the ruach shafalim. So the those who are humble have the Ruach Shephalim, which is a Shephal Ruach. They have the spirit of the humble is a humble spirit, so to speak. If we look at this verse here, we see those two phrases very similar to the phrase that Yeshua uses in Matthew 5. And in my opinion, it's much more likely that Yeshua came quoting the Tanakh in the language that the Tanakh is written in, Hebrew, than it is that he was speaking Greek. So by going down the path of picking a very definite meaning of the Hebrew words that Yeshua would have spoken, choosing a very definite meaning in the Greek is actually not really helpful to us, and it might actually mislead us because it might not be poor in spirit, rather those who are low in spirit, those who have Shafal Ruach, humble spirit or low in spirit. Often in Hebrew we see parallelisms, and they can take two forms. They can either say the same thing in two different ways, or they give opposites. And here we have an example of where the same thing is said but using opposites. So, give ear, O heavens, hear, O earth, heavens and the earth being opposite, and the opposites are used to say the same thing, to hear the words of Yehovah's mouth. Proverbs 29:23 says, the pride of a man brings him low, but the humble in spirit, the Shefal Ruach, obtains esteem. Okay, so here we see opposites being used to say the same thing. The pride of man brings him low, but the humble in spirit, so the opposites, obtains esteem. So it's saying the same thing, using opposites. So one will bring you low, one will bring you to esteem. But again, we see the words used in Shem Tov's Matthew. We see them actually earlier in the scriptures. Here is the Hebrew of that verse. You can see those words, recognize the shapes. This word here, or this part of it, is a part of the word tashvilnu, but its core is the word shafal. And here we see first letter there is a vav, which means and, shafal ruach. So from earlier in the scriptures we see shafal ruach is a common idea. Psalm 51 verse 17 says, the sacrifices of Elohim are a broken spirit, a heart broken and crushed. So this doesn't actually use shafal ruach, but we can see that the idea, the concept of having a low spirit are there. Proverbs 29:11 says, a fool lets out all his spirit, all his ruach, but the wise calms it down. So we've got the idea there of having kind of, if your spirit is something that when you are angry you let out, and something that you can calm down, then we can see the same concept within that. To have a low spirit, I would suggest, is the opposite of having a high hand. To be low in spirit, you could understand that as being humble in spirit. It's neither. It's being shafal in spirit. We can understand that shafal approximates roughly to being low or being humble. I would say closer to being low than we can understand if we take in all of the context of Scripture and what is taught about how one's spirit should be. Then we get a better idea of what is being said, rather than putting it into Greek and choosing, well, the word that I'm going to choose to translate this as is tochos, or tohos, meaning very definitely poor. Isaiah 53 verse 7 says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, but he did not open his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent. But he did not open his mouth." And I would suggest that this is a good example of what it is to be low in spirit, to be lowly in spirit. This is the Mashiach that we're talking about here, that was taken unjustly, and as he said, if he desired to, he could pray and his Father would send a legion of angels, but he didn't. He was low in spirit, and we are actually told to be the same. In 1 Peter 2:13-25 it says, "Be subject to every institution of man because of the Master or because of the Lord, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of doers of evil and a praise for those who do good. Because such is the will of Elohim, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using your freedom as a cloak for evil, but as servants of Elohim. Respect all, love the brotherhood, fear Elohim, respect the king. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the crooked ones. For this is favor or grace, if because of conscience toward Elohim anyone bears up under grief, suffering unrighteously. For what credit is there in enduring a beating when you sin? But if you suffer for doing good, and you endure, this finds favor with Elohim. For to this you were called, because Messiah also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who being reviled did not revile in return, suffering did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his body upon the timber, so that we, having died to sins, might live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. So this is what it is to be low in spirit. Even when you're suffering unrighteously, to endure, to be low in spirit and not kind of like those who have got a high hand, and think just because it's unrighteous that you're suffering, that you are able to rebel against the authorities that Yehovah has put in place. As it says, Yeshua is our example in that he suffered unrighteously, certainly, and yet he was silent before his accusers. Similarly, in 1 Peter 3, 8-18, the next chapter, it says, to sum up, let all of you be like-minded, sympathetic, loving as brothers, tender-hearted, humble-minded, which I would suggest is what it is to be shafal ruach, humble-spirited or low of spirit, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, blessing, knowing that you were called to this in order to inherit a blessing. Blessed are the humble in spirit. For he who wishes to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. We're going to see later on, blessed are the peacemakers, is what the Greek says. Blessed are those who pursue shalom, is what the Hebrew says. Because the eyes of Yehovah are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the face of Yehovah is against those who do evil. And who is the one doing evil to you if you become imitators of the good? But even if you suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not fear their threats, neither be troubled. Again, blessed are the low in spirit. But sanctify or set apart, make holy Yehovah Elohim in your hearts, and always be ready to give an answer to everyone asking you a reason concerning the expectation that is in you, with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, so that when they speak against you as doers of evil, those who falsely accuse your good behavior in Messiah shall be ashamed. For it is better, if it is the will of Elohim, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil, because even Messiah once suffered for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to Elohim, having been put to death indeed in flesh, but made alive in spirit. So you put yourself in the hands of the one who judges righteously because you have faith in him. You're not kind of arrogant or high in spirit in your own estimations of yourself. You are low in spirit, putting yourself in his hand, and the ones so doing are blessed. Matthew 5 verse 4 says, blessed are those who mourn, because they shall be comforted. That's what the Greek words mean. But if we look at Shem, we see here, it says, Ashrei, blessed are, Ha-chokim is what it says. Chokim is actually the plural of the noun form of the verb chaka, which means to wait. So we have it translated into English from the Hebrew as blessed are those who wait. And this is actually in line with the teaching of Scripture. Isaiah 30 verse 18 says, and therefore Yehovah shall wait, and there's that verb, chaka, to show you favor or grace, and therefore he shall be exalted to have compassion on you. For Yehovah is an Elohim of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him. Okay, so that's the same meaning, not the exact same words, but the same meaning. Kal chokeh, without going into Hebrew, is essentially the same as blessed are the chokim. Just different plurals that are used there. Blessed are the meek, Greek word praus, which meek is a fair translation of praus, but perhaps not of the Hebrew, because they shall inherit the earth. The gay, gay is a Hebrew word which would be roughly equivalent to the Hebrew word eretz. You might have heard of haaretz, the land or the earth. Eretz can mean the earth as a whole. It can mean just the ground. It can mean the land of Israel, or it can mean a specific land or a specific country. And gay is a similar word. We see praus here. I'm not going to read all the way through that, but if you pause the video and read what they've got to say about it there, you can see that it is a word that has become understood in a certain way according to certain doctrine, and you've got kind of the thinking of man which has been put on top of it, and you've got all sorts of sermons that have been preached about blessed are the meek, meek meaning those who are gentle, and this isn't necessarily what was being said. If we go again to the Hebrew, what we have here is ha'anavim. Okay, blessed are ha'anavim. We see here the Hebrew word is eretz. Okay, they shall inherit the eretz. And it comes from Psalm 37. But the meek ones, the anavim, ha'anavim, shall inherit ha'eretz, the earth, and delight themselves in plenty of shalom. So both praus and anav can be translated as humble as well as meek. Praus lends itself more to meek, but again it's making concrete something that in the Hebrew certainly is not concrete. But we can see that Yeshua here is teaching from the writings. He's saying the same thing. So we need to get a better idea of what anav means, and therefore what anavim means, the plural of anav, those who are anav, in other words. Psalm 149 verse 4 says, "For Yehovah takes pleasure in his people, he adorns the anavim with Yeshua." It's what it says. Yeshua's name being a masculine noun, whereas Yeshua is not a masculine noun. Yeshua means he shall or he will save, he will shua. When you have a yod at the beginning of a verb, it means he shall. It's future tense. Yeshua, meaning to save or to deliver. So that's what Yeshua is. But this is a related word which would be pronounced in the same way as Yeshua. Here we've got the word anav, and we can see Blue Letter Bible reckon it to be used to mean poor, humble, afflicted, or it could be meek. When it's put into the Greek, it's very definitely translated as meek, but interestingly can mean poor, in line with what he's already said about those who are low in spirit, those who are humble in spirit, those who are not doing things with a high hand. Blessed are those who wait for Yehovah. You could kind of say that blessed are those who mourn is in line with earlier teachings of Scripture, but blessed are those who wait is more kind of directly written in Hebrew. But this is continuing the theme, and indeed the theme will continue throughout. You can understand perhaps why poor in spirit would have been selected as the Greek translation. If they were translating from Hebrew, all of these words kind of suggest poor, but if we can see the Hebrew, which Yeshua would have been likely to have been speaking, then we can get more breadth to what Yeshua is actually saying. And we don't really need to put it in concrete Greek terms or concrete English terms. We can just kind of get the flavor of what Yeshua is saying when we take all of it together. The other word that we saw before is ani. You can see ani means very similar to what we see anav, meaning if you look at the two words here at the top, we've got different vowels, but the words look very similar. The difference is in the final letter. This is a vav here, this is a yod here. The difference when you are writing a vav to a yod is one is kind of like half of a vav. That would be the yod. And then the vav is like if you continued that stroke all the way along. And when people are writing these words, they are very easy to mix up, in fact. This is the Aleppo Codex. You can see here that it says Aniyim. So the plural of the Ani are the Aniyim. And then here in the margin is a note which says that it is written as Aniyim, but it should be read as Anivim, or the other way round, rather. It's written as Anavim, but it should be understood actually as Aniyim. So when they were writing out these copies of the scriptures, if they made a mistake, they wouldn't scrub out the word and then write it properly. They would put a note in the margin. And we see this with Anavim to Aniyim. We also see it the other way around as well. So in Isaiah 32, it says, "He has devised wicked plans to destroy the poor with words of falsehood." talking about the scoundrel. Even when the needy pleads for justice. So we can see here, this is that passage. It is written anav, but it's translated as the poor here, and that is correct. From the margin we can see it should be ani, which would be the plural, and we can see from the parallelism used here that ani is the correct one. The poor and the needy, evion, is synonymous with ani. So we see the parallelism here between the ani and the evion, even though the word that was written was the anav. So my point is that it's easy to confuse these words. Here, also in the Aleppo Codex, we see this word here is aniyim. That's what they wrote when they were copying it. But in the margin, it says that it should be read anavim. So we see it both ways. We see anavim when it should be aniyim, and we see aniyim written when it should be anavim. It's because the words are so similar. So my point is that when we read of the anavim, it could well be talking about the poor. It could well be talking about the aniyim. In Psalm 10 verse 2, which is what this is the Hebrew of, it says, in arrogance the wrongdoer hotly pursues the poor. And it is written aniyim. But as it says in the margin, it was supposed to be anavim. So we see in arrogance the wrongdoer hotly pursues the should be anavim. And if anavim means humble, we can see the parallelism there between the wrongdoer doing in arrogance and those who are humble, the opposite of arrogance. So we can see that the word should in fact be anavim. In Luke 6 verse 20, this is the Sermon on the Plain, remember, it actually says, blessed are the poor. So it could be that what we have recorded in Matthew 5 in Greek should have actually been aniyim as opposed to anavim. So it might be blessed are the humble, for they shall inherit the earth, but it could have also been blessed are the poor, the aniyim, for they shall inherit the earth. That would fit in with what we have in the Sermon on the Plain, and it would also fit in with something else which is quite interesting about inheriting the gay, or inheriting haaretz, the earth or the land. Luke 4:16-19 says, Yeshua came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and according to his practice he went into the congregation on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Yeshua was handed to him. Having unrolled the scroll, he found the place where it was written, the Spirit of Yehovah is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring the good news, the gospel, to the poor, which is the aniyim in the Hebrew. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to send away crushed ones with a release. So proclaim the acceptable year of Yahovah. And what he is reading from, Isaiah 61, is talking about Yom Kippur, when the trumpet would sound and release was declared. He's talking about the Jubilee year, more precisely, which would be announced on Yom Kippur. And he reads the first half of it, and he mentions to bring the good news to the poor. Okay, so we've got the poor and we've got a release mentioned. If we learn a little bit more about the nature of this release, perhaps we can see a bit better what Yeshua was saying in the Sermon on the Mount. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me. And in all the country you possess, that word is achuzah, you shall allow a redemption of the land. The word achuzah, we see here, is talking about possession by inheritance. Okay, so when it says, you shall possess the land, he's just said, the land is not yours, it's mine. So it's given to people by an inheritance. And it says, if his hand has not found enough to give back to him, then what was sold shall remain in the hand of him who bought it until the year of Jubilee. And it shall be released in the Jubilee, and he shall return to his possession. It's that word achuzah again, which means a possession by inheritance. So it is possible that a deeper way to understand what Yeshua was saying in the Sermon on the Mount is blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the land. Because he came to preach the good news to the poor, to preach the year of release when they would inherit the land. Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the land, is a way that we can understand that. So I hope you can see that what we have in the Greek of Matthew, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, is kind of like a more crystallized, more realized form of the Hebrew, and perhaps the words that are chosen to translate those Hebrew concepts are not the best, and can make us think that Yeshua was saying something that he wasn't. There have been countless sermons preached on the Sermon on the Mount, and as well-intentioned as I'm sure they are perhaps not true. But we'll continue reading through the Sermon on the Mount as we go through this series till we reach the end of what Yeshua said in Matthew 7. Yahovah willing, I'll see you next time.